I'll throw it open at this point. I am, I think, particularly interested in finding out, examples people have, but also a sense of what in this agenda, what you have seen that has worked well in the last 10 years initially, and then we can come to some of the challenges and constraints later. But any comments from the floor? Anyone want to kick off? Marta.
Hi, Marta.
Please introduce yourself.
Marta Foresti. I'm the head of the Politics and Governance Program at ODI that's worked with DFID and others in the last 10 years on this agenda. I've got I guess a comment and a proposal, both related to the results agenda. The comment is that, of course, as we point the lens towards the practice of political economy analysis and trying to really come up with some good evidence of whether it has worked well or not, we need to bear in mind, as I think Andy just reminded us to do, that we should apply the same rules to ourselves. So it is very likely this work is particularly effective at achieving incremental change within organizations, in shifting culture, in providing space. And it would be a real shame if, in the search for the holy grail of can we prove that this improves effectiveness, development effectiveness, we lost sight of some of these important changes that have happened. So when we do that review, we need to make sure to build in some ways of capturing those important process change. And the proposal is to link up something that Alina and Stefan have said. Again, Stefan reminded us about how this agenda has the potential to contribute to the results discourse and not necessarily to go head-to-head with it. And I think one way to do it is something that Alina proposed, which is that perhaps as well as trying to look back at how effective this has been, maybe we should experiment with the idea of political economy ongoing engagement and processes. I mean, there is a limit to which an analytical piece can change the world, okay? The reports can have the most upfront and explicit recommendations on what should be done about it, but ultimately whether it happens or not depends on a number of factors. So following that up, and perhaps next time a piece of work gets commissioned in a particular country, to actually invest in the monitoring, not just in the analysis, but actually on the uptake and what facilitates or prevents uptake, and what does it take for people to act on it, and to be able to monitor that and report on it might be as useful as maybe also useful in addition to the systematic review of whether the studies have made a difference. I think collectively, having done a number of now studies, we are a bit puzzled by how little is actually invested in the follow-up, and perhaps it's not that surprising that there is that follow-up is a bit disappointing because of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marta.
My name is Luis Vieira. I was previously the head of Chief of Mission for IOM in East Timor for 8 years.
There's a microphone coming your way.
Start again, I'm sorry. So my name is Luis Vieira. I was 8 years the Chief of Mission for the International Organization for Migration in Timor, and I worked in several other places. I'm now at SOAS, so my question may not surprise anyone. I have a question about the interaction between a political economy analysis at a given target country vis-a-vis a macro level, as I think you mentioned, of the institutions of aid and development as such. Because as we know, an individual agency can only play a very limited role, particularly when contrasted with the role of finance, trade policy, and relating to your comment vis-a-vis the technical apparatus, what do you see now and what do you see in the future as far as a discussion at these different levels, from the country level to the beginning to question and look at political economy into the very fabric of the macro approaches to development? And how do you see that going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take this. Steve will take, I think, 2 more, and then we'll go back to the panel. I think it's a better.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Stephen Jones from Oxford Policy Management. As Alex said, we were closely involved in some of the initial work for DFID in this area, and I've just got 1 or 2 reflections from OPM's recent experience on what we would see as being the factors that tend to make political economy analysis effective. First, and I think it would be the observation that it very much depends on there being a clearly defined problem with strong ownership from the commissioning agency of that problem, a feeling that's something they need to do something about. It helps if it's a problem that's at least potentially tractable in some way or another, and that you can have a process of addressing how to kind of properly formulate it, and you've got involvement of many of the key stakeholders who are trying to tackle this rather than just a single donor. I think it also helps if you do the analysis at a point where there are already some articulated views on what to do, like a sort of an initial design of a program or project, because I think that then means you've got something that you can test. And to me, the real value of PEA is a way of sort of testing to destruction the intervention logic, and that's easier if you've got something which is there, but something which is not yet set in stone. I think there's a danger of this often coming in too late, or at a point where the political economy of the donor's engagement means actually you can't really change anything. Mm-hmm. So there's an important timing question there.
Communication strategy.
Well, yes. And then I think how effective it is depends on the context within which the work is done.
Right.
And I've mostly done this work in reasonably open and democratic environments where people are very keen to talk about the problem, but many cases this isn't the case. The nature of donor engagement and donors, how constructive donors are and how well the relations are within the donor group. The level of skills and particularly local knowledge that you can bring to bear. Because I also think most of the PA I've done that I feel is successful has really been an exercise in facilitating the bringing of local knowledge to the attention of donors in a systematic kind of way, rather than something you bring in as an external consultant. And I think my major frustration has been how difficult it is to persuade donors to get this stuff into the public domain once it's done, even when it's not actually that politically sensitive.
Yeah.
So, a few observations there.
Yeah, that's one we've all seen, I think. But anyway, behind you.
Hello, is this microphone on?
Yes, I think it's
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Julia and I'm a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. Thank you very much for your presentations. DFID and other donor agencies that engage in political economy analysis, they fund projects, but of course often those projects are being implemented by implementing partners such as UN organizations, large international NGOs, local NGOs, which to my knowledge are not engaging in PE analysis thinking as much as, for example, DFID is. So I was wondering to what extent DFID in this case is engaging and cooperating with its implementing partners on promoting PE, and how do you do this? How does this work in practice? Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. I think at this point I'll go back to the panel and then we'll take another round of questions afterwards. But quick responses at this point. Alina?
Okay, quick responses. One thing is I don't think we should be banging our heads against the wall in terms of these results frustration with political economy analysis, because I think overall it's very difficult to show in any case that X type of development project can lead to X type of or Y type of developmental outcome. So it's not a problem of political economy per se, and as I have said, I think political economy analysis can be used as a tool of refining what your results agenda should be. I'm in terms of what the point that Marta was talking about, and this is something that I very briefly mentioned, but the need really to give follow-up to the kind of work that is being commissioned on political economy is really important. Those GACA exercises that I was mentioning earlier try to do this a little bit, where they did have a purposeful workshop on uptake actions, but then they sort of dropped the ball there. And that's already dropping the ball later in the game, because most of the time the ball is dropped at the point of submitting a report and maybe having a presentation about it, and that's it. But to be able to really give this meaning and traction over time, it would be very important to be able to go back and revisit. And I was doing a very interesting project on state building in the Palestinian, occupied Palestinian territories with the UNDP, and there was an effort to do that. And in the end, it didn't happen, which was a real shame, because again, all of this lesson learning is lost. So I think I like the proposal Marta was making. And just briefly, in terms of the global, I think the original, correct me if I'm wrong with the drivers of change, but at least with the macro type of analysis, how the global interacts with the domestic is extremely important, and understanding why a country is governed in the way that it is without taking into account the broader international context is very difficult. And I think in the area of global incentives, is one of the areas where political economy analysis can have much traction, I think, in terms of pointing to action not only of donors but also of international actors more broadly to be able to shift the incentive structures more broadly. So I will just leave it at that.
Thank you, Elena. Stefan?
Okay, evaluation of political economy analysis. Yes, good point.
I'm bringing the Dutch, remember?
And the Dutch. I mean, there were actually quite a few reviews done of the drivers of change experience, and I would say, I think that, I guess, spawned the shift to much more sector and problem-focused approaches. What we haven't done yet is to go back and look at the more recent experience, and I certainly, and it is something actually we've been thinking about. We've actually just commissioned a survey, an initial survey of DFID staff, because one of the problems we have centrally is actually we don't know the totality of the work that's been done on this agenda. So we need to get a handle on that first, but I certainly think a thoroughgoing review and evaluation is timely, and perhaps next year we might be able to come back with some more concrete offerings on what this work has delivered. And I really do take the point that it's not just about looking at individual programs and whether a particular analysis solved a set of problems and led to better practice in the design and delivery of the program. It's about measuring, somehow trying to evaluate much more subtle shifts in the culture of an organisation, in the way we think, in the way we work, and in the way that this agenda in its totality has, in the way you set out, I think, in your presentation, Alina, actually shift the focus of our work at a very strategic level. I think in terms of long-term development impact, I feel a bit like this is the situation of the French Revolution here, and in some senses it's a bit too early to tell, but of course that's something we should be looking now to monitor and evaluate better. And I think Marta's points on actually following through the analysis through to program design, implementation, and impact is a really good one, and that's what we need to be doing much more of. The counterfactual, I'm glad you brought that. That's something I wanted to mention, because a lot of this is very difficult to assess because you don't know the counterfactual of what would have happened if you had not done an analysis. Of course, we know the stories of what's gone wrong in terms of big political seismic events, but also smaller development failures. That we know, but what we don't know is when this investment in analytical work writ large has actually helped to mitigate some of those failures. So any kind of evaluation, I think, would also need to grapple with those kinds of questions, which are really, really challenging. In terms of some really good points from Stephen, which I had wanted to touch on in terms of what makes for a successful political economy analysis. I mean, it's obvious points, but the getting your purpose clear from the start, being clear about your audience, having clarity of what the problem is you're seeking to address, and ensuring that the timing is right. Yes, we have certain planning and implementation cycles, and doing analysis in advance of those is obviously better than doing it after the fact. So all of those points, I think, are really important. Implementing partners, I'd be lying if I could tell a story on that, and my sense is it's hit and miss, and it's largely contingent on the extent to which, in the context of the program design, the program officer or the particular sector advisor is alive to these issues, and then they're built into the implementation contract. And if we had more time, I could tell you about an experience we had on civil service reform in Palestine, which was actually all about the implementing partners doing the analysis, using that analysis to inform the work they were doing with actually quite good results. One last point, sorry, just on the global issue, because I think this is really important. And one of the, again, hard to measure, but definitely true implications of our work on political economy analysis is that we've started to understand that incentives at the country level are shaped by the global arena, often much more than what we can do through our aid programs at the country level. And that's shifted DFID's focus. So, we now have significant international engagements on the international corruption agenda, on work around money laundering, and all these sets of issues, really important. And again, another sort of indicator of the value of our thinking about politics at the country level and how it's had all kinds of spin-offs in terms of the way we frame the development challenge.
Alex, if you don't mind, I'm going to pull you in on the last one because I do want to fit in another round, and we'll go here first. Yeah, thank you. Have we got mics?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Rebecca Engel. I'm a research associate with the Center for International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University, but I'm also a doctoral candidate here at SOAS. And so I have a question partly related to what I'm hearing indirectly, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the degree to which the political economy analysis tools actually incorporate any of the types of questions that might be included in a conflict analysis, and looking at, is there a connection? It seems to me anything that you would be looking at in political economy would be also looking at conflict-sensitive development practices, and I wonder to the degree to which there is communication between the people working in different from different perspectives on the same issue, because often, especially the funding streams are very separate. Those who are conflict prevention and peace building are often very separate from development funding streams. And I was just also thinking, because you're talking about tools and developing tools and thinking about how some of our work has has moved from conflict assessment tools that are very snapshot, one-off, that don't get followed up necessarily, to early warning and response, which is somehow a way to incorporate the continued analysis over time that links to implementation and response that feeds over time and looking at trends. And so you never really stop the analysis, and you keep building on the response in a feedback loop, which may be a way of also thinking about some of the other questions that were asked today in terms of how do you not just write a report and then be done with it, but continue the follow-up. So,
thank you very much, Rebecca. One question here, and then I'm going to go over the other side for a couple.
Thank you very much. My name is Gary Jenkins. Like some of the other people here, I'm ex-DFID. I was there for about 20 years. One of the last things I was doing in DFID was pulling together our thinking about scaling up. In other words, what are we going to do with all the extra money as we go to 0.7%? And that led to some of the things we've been talking about today, like the results agenda and the focus on fragile states and so forth. The question I wanted to ask was something that Alex said, and I just wanted to see if other people agree with it, that there's a challenge for the ownership agenda in the Paris Declaration from this work. And that was something that when we were thinking about scaling up and what to do with all the extra money, we had a lot of trouble keeping the country ownership issue at the front and not just having a results agenda drive it or an MDGs agenda drive it and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to ask whether people feel that where people think the country ownership agenda fits into this, and where is DFID now with that stuff. Thanks very much.
You get a lot of nice questions. We'll move over this side. I think we had Peter and a couple more here.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Peter Owen. I used to work for DFID until about 3 or 4 years ago, and on many of these.
Can you raise your voice a little?
Yeah. Okay. Is this coming through the microphone? I don't know.
Not very strongly.
Okay.
I think it's a phantom microphone, isn't it?
I think it's for people out there more than it's for us.
Right. 2 or 3 quick points then. First of all, I think we should not be too hard on this test of delivering results, because after all, governance and political economy analysis are just one of a series of analysis that go into everything that the agency does. And it's been very difficult even to measure the impact of aid. There have been several studies on that, and they're equivocal. What I think, for example, does anyone require people to show that the country plans have made a difference, or anything else that a donor agency does? So don't be more demanding of the governance analysis than you are of the other stuff, right? The second point is that I think the story could be told better of where the governance and political economy analysis has assisted in defining problems, identifying stakeholders, and making operations better. And I think certainly in the early days, DFID made a great effort to mainstream governance analysis into the sector and other operations that were going on. When I think the governance agenda acquired a kind of greater impetus, there was a tendency to try and do governance projects, of which there is certainly a role. But these tend to be more difficult, and if you go and search for opportunities to tackle corruption generically, you might find it much more difficult than, say, tackling corruption in some particular area that you're working in with a problem-driven approach, for example, on land management, where you might find some stakeholders who are actually interested in doing something, rather than doing the problem generically and setting up an anti-corruption commission. And we all know what happened to them. So this is the 2 points, really. Don't be over demanding of your governance analysis, and show more clearly the story of where it's helped operationally. And then if I could put in a third point, since we're in ODI, I think a lot of the responsibility for showing what difference this made will have to be left with the longer term researchers who can delve much more deeply into these things than is possible within the scope of the sort of short consultancy analyses that donors often commission. So we look to the researchers to provide some answers on this, and it's very encouraging to see that ODI is actually on the case.
One of my favourite recent quotes was someone who said in a meeting, "There may just be no evidence," which I think is always worth bearing in mind. Lenny, no, we'll take you first and then Lenny. Yeah. So we'll take the speaker.
Thank you very much. David French, Convener Associates.
Yeah, can we limit to about 1 minute per person, because we're getting to...
I'll try and be very brief. Three brief points. First is an observation. I came into all this having led the Westminster Foundation for Democracy for 6 years, and found that even in an organization which exists and was created to do the political development work, the tendency is to get into technical work rather than political work, because it is easier. It is just simply easier to default into doing technical work. Second, a question. Stefan, you talked about this work in the development community being essentially still a niche business. I wonder whether one of the challenges is that is still in front of political analysis, political economy analysis work, as being to take it out into the diplomatic community, so that it becomes less niche and actually gets more into the worlds that other people who work internationally inhabit. And the third is also an observation, which is that working politically very frequently involves working at specifically or at national level in the deepest areas of conflict in the countries and societies and sectors that you choose to work in. And I suggest that one of the reasons that too many projects and programs default out of out of seeking political program solutions is because it is simply very difficult to stay with and find programs which are capable of not veering away from the very conflicts that they're trying to address.
Thank you. Lenny, again, quickly, a minute.
Okay, I'll try. Lenny Wild from ODI. Just wanted to very much endorse the points about kind of process and follow through. I mean, recent work that I was part of in Malawi, looking at service delivery and accountability in political economy issues, and work that my colleague Dan Harris doing, sitting in the corner, on sectoral PE, particularly in water. I think we've been trying to experiment with approaches which combine in almost a package of forms of training, forms of problem-driven studies, that actually really involve program staff throughout rather than in a one-off interview and then a report at the end, and really actually investing quite a lot of our time and attention in building the relationship so that you can sustain it, you know, both before, during and after your time in country. And we're definitely finding that seems to be getting more traction in terms of the potential for take-up, at least. And it just strikes me that, you know, we're trying internally at ODI to reflect on our own experience about how to do this sort of work better. I know that Steve and Alex and others have a wealth of experience, and we could maybe be pooling it ourselves, as well as thinking about how donors and others can take up, because I think we have some good thoughts there. And I think another point to just very quickly raise is that we tend to focus the conversation a little bit on some of the usual suspects, and I'm sorry, Stefan, I think DFID is often one of those. And what we're seeing increasingly is other actors, you know, UN agencies, NGOs, you know, some private sector organisations increasingly coming to us with an interest and an openness to thinking about some of these approaches and how they might inform their work. Now, that brings with it its own set of challenges, but I think it's something that we shouldn't overlook when we're thinking about the progress in this area.
It's like a vast thing of political risk analysis in the private sector going on for 50 years or more. Just a vast sort of store of stuff in the ways in which that's approached. Dan, apologies. I'm just going to take one. Oh, you're looking so disappointed. Okay, 1 minute from Dan. All right.
Even under a minute.
Yeah.
I'd just like to very quickly suggest that there might be a confluence of a number of things that have been mentioned thus far, and I think it occurs around this issue of becoming more focused and on doing problem-driven analysis in particular sectors. I think that's sort of one way of sort of looking very clearly at a context-specific analysis that is not necessarily specific to the country context, but even to the donor in question, and looking at the relevant points in the program cycle, the timing, the buy-in, as Stephen was mentioning. But the challenge is then to link that, I think, to Peter's comment about linking governance work back into sector work and into the work of sector professionals, and therefore then the buy-in of sector professionals and their willingness to engage with this agenda is thus key. And therefore, you know, in terms of when you start looking at evaluation, one of the key tests will be, have you convinced sector staff to invest time and energy in this type of analysis? And that will be the proof that the agenda has really made progress. It's when it no longer has to be funded out of governance trust funds and those sort of things. So look there, and that's your confirmation.
Still a way to go, I would say, on my own experience. Just to finish up, there's two great questions in from Heather Marquette, who's Director of the Governance and Social Development Resource Centre at University of Birmingham. The first one is, if we move from a first-generation agenda to a second-generation agenda, do we risk losing some of the benefits of a big-picture analysis, especially as the big picture changes? And the second one, that's obviously the problem-driven narrative there. And the second one, how far will PEA be embedded in staff thinking if it's both designed and done largely by external consultants? So two questions there. Now, obviously, there's more there than you're going to be able to pick up in your responses. So maybe if you pick off one or two as we go across, and I do want to leave time for Julian to come in. So.
Right. I mean, I think several comments. Luis, Stephen, and Heather. I think there is a general risk we should be aware of, which is that we leap onto political economy analysis and kind of tame it and turn it into a convenient instrument for donor agencies, losing, I think, some of the fundamental characteristics. I think a fundamental characteristic needs to start as consciously as we can with understanding that local situation and not starting with our own norms. Obviously, it can't be objective as such, but nevertheless, don't start with that. Don't start with the development aid issue, and I think that was your point. I mean, one of the lessons for me is that aid and aid agencies, they're not insignificant, but they're not the big determinants and big players. So be careful of the risk of, in the end, losing some of the cutting edge and value of this. I think Gary's point about the Paris Declaration ownership, I think is interesting. I mean, clearly the Accra development took the ownership agenda and said, well, actually, you've got to consult and so on. So it's not just the administration. But I don't think that altogether answers the problem for development agencies of what happens fundamentally if development problems are, as it were, in part a result of actions, incentives, and so on by the people that you're supposed to be giving the lead to. And I don't have a simple answer to that. There are grey area answers, I think. And a very last point. I think there are good examples of building local institutions long-term to be undertaking this kind of analysis in the country, being done by citizens. There's some excellent examples. I mean, my favorite at the moment is the Institute of Governance Studies in Bangladesh, which I think does some great work. And it's internalizing in that country this kind of analysis. So it's not being carried out by foreigners at the instigation of foreign organizations. And I think long-term, that has to be the way forward for a lot of this work.
Thank you very much, Alex. Stefan, your last thoughts.
Okay, I feel conflicted because there were so many great comments. I feel like I want to respond to them all, but I feel the chair breathing down my neck, so I'll be selective. The ownership agenda. I guess I've got quite a renegade view on this, which is similar to my view on the results agenda. I mean, I regard this work as actually strengthening our understanding of the country context in which we're working with, and thereby leading to us having a much more honest, open and informed policy dialogue with country partners. And while I guess I would accept the accusation that in many cases it's difficult to do this work in a joined up fashion in many of the environments in which you work, I think the output from this work is to make us donors much more realistic, informed and pragmatic in terms of our engagement with country partners, and understanding much better the constraints and the parameters which our partners face. So I see this agenda actually quite aligned with the ownership agenda. Great salutary warnings from Peter. I guess my one counter to your point that we shouldn't set the bar too high, and certainly not higher than other areas of aid investment, which we are committed to, is that the bar across the board is rising, and within DFID, I think we are having to be much more rigorous about evidence, about monitoring and evaluation, and about telling a story of impact. And I think we do need to rise to that challenge to a greater or lesser degree, but with the caveat that we need to be sophisticated in the way that we do it. Which other ones? I should, since Heather's taken the trouble to write in. Yes, I think there is a risk that the shift to second generation work stops us investing in understanding countries as a whole, and the points that you have raised about the role of aid actors within a much wider political economy, and there's a risk that we may start missing the wood for the trees. And there's also a risk that you alluded to, Andy, which is that we start defining what the development problem is for our own needs, rather than taking a much more sort of bigger picture approach on actually what are the development challenges that this whole country is facing, what's the underlying political economy, and what does that mean at a strategic level for how we can engage. So there's definitely risks around that. In terms of the balance between if we contract it out, how are we going to upgrade our staff skills and knowledge, I think that's a valid point, and we've tried to address that to some extent by having training on political economy analysis, which is open to staff across the organisation, making sure that questions around politics are hot-wired into our business cases and our strategic planning processes. But I do think we could be a bit better at developing tools which make it easier for staff to engage on this agenda and which enable them to do some of the updating and refining of analysis on an ongoing basis, rather than feeling the need to having to commit long consultancy heavy studies all the time. But that's a work in progress, but I think we're quite cognizant of that risk and are trying to do our best to address it. In fact, if I may say, one of the positive spin-offs from the consultancy freeze in Whitehall at the moment is that in lots of areas staff are having to upgrade their own knowledge rather than contracting out all the difficult problems to consultants.
Thanks very much.
I would say you must contract consultants to do all of the hard work.
Very quickly, Alina, because
just
I'm
very
conscious
briefly,
we're running over on time.
There are two things that I just wanted to touch upon. This conflict question and PEA. Actually, very funnily, the main problem that I had with the Colombia SGACA exercise was because there had been a previous conflict assessment that had been commissioned, and there had been no sharing of information available. I think that it is very difficult to carry out political economy analysis that is serious, that would not incorporate conflict dynamics, full stop. But it is true that there is a proliferation of this kind of work that does not necessarily speak to each other, and that has to be sort of worked on in the measure that more of these things are rolled out. And in terms of the question of ownership and the Paris Declaration, I actually think that political economy analysis may be the tool that you need to actually give meaning to this whole concept of ownership to begin with, because I think within the Paris Declaration there's this easy assumption that, oh, you know, they just need to develop some kind of program and it's owned by them and then we align and that's problem solved. And in reality that's not the case, and a political economy analysis can really help reflect on that. So I will close on that note.
Thank you very much, Alina. Just to encourage you to stay the last 10 minutes for Julian, I should also say that DAI have kindly helped us with providing a reception afterwards. So we'll be moving, I think, over there. But Julian, you've been very patient. Thanks very much for waiting.
No, not at all. I wasn't aware that we were contributing to the reception. So, in that case, I myself shall stay.
Yeah.
But